water. Now you have to remember that the Romans did use glassware, the combination of sand and other components to make glassware. So glassware was found in Roman times. So still life with peaches, a very early 1st century AD still life on in the House of the Stags to decorate the home of a very affluent individual. Speaking of affluent individuals, we have another magnificent fresco. It's the basket of figs, and the Villa Pompeia was kind of in between the Bay of Naples and Sorrento. So it says Pompeii, but it was in the region of Pompeii, Herculaneum Pompeii, and this Pompeia. Now, when I mentioned highborn people, this was the second wife of Nero, Emperor Nero. So this was their magnificent seaside villa with a beautiful view of the Bay of Naples and magnificent room after room. And this would have decorated one of the dining areas, perhaps. Now, you have these purple and green figs. You would see these figs even today around the area where Mount Vesuvius erupted because the soil is so fertile. So if you were to go there today, you might even see fig trees like this. But they're exquisite with their different coloration. Look at the remarkable woven basket on this fresco. And then, of course, this beautiful ledge gives it a very nice three-dimensional quality, because one of the 4 types of Roman painting, the 4 styles, was this architectural one, and it really did use what's called trompe-l'oeil. And we're going to look at the idea of trompe-l'oeil, French for fool the eye, in just a little while, because some of the earliest still lifes did incorporate this idea of fooling the eye to make it look very real and almost like you could touch it. And you might not feel that so much with the figs, but you definitely can see a three-dimensional quality to this ledge. And one more thing I'd like to point out is, you know, the concept of fresco painting, as I mentioned, this was very popular in Italy. Italy was a warm climate, and you didn't need tapestries and paintings to warm up so much as you did in the north. So fresco painting became very popular in Italy. And also you saw it in Greece too. We see it in Greece, but look how you can kind of see the application of paint. And then these elements here, and I'm not sure if my arrow, but if you look at the upper right-hand corner, I'll just mention that, you can actually see where it's been chipped away. So that is a little bit of how fresco is underneath. Now, so let's just talk about one more historical element. I mentioned that still life emerges in antiquity. We just saw 3 examples, Egyptian and 2 Italian, 2 Roman, but still life, unfortunately, kind of loses its momentum during the Middle Ages. It's really not until the late Middle Ages that we begin to see manuscript illumination. And that's where we begin to see more still lifes. It isn't really until the Renaissance in the 16th century that we begin to see still life again for still life's sake. Now, here is a folio from a prose treatise on the 7 vices, and it is what's called a codex. A codex would be the early or the predecessor to today manuscripts or books. Remember, the printing press was not invented by Gutenberg until almost 100 years, a little more than 100 years later, 1440, let's be specific. So this was a handmade book, and it was an Italian handmade book. And what I will show you in just a moment is many of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts actually came from Italy, from Flanders. You know, they were Flemish, they were from Ghent and Bruges, and also the French court. If you look at the Book of Hours, the Trévicheurs, the Limburg brothers. So it comes mostly from the north. So this was from Genoa, and it was commissioned by an aristocrat from Genoa, and he wanted his children to have kind of an idea of virtue and vices. So this is what this page illustrates. Now, the other pages is that there are multiple pages for this like folio you would see figures of men, for example, dressed in really exotic costumes, showing a little bit of an interest in in more exotic locales. But this one focuses a lot on these wonderful creatures, these beautiful spiders and the dragonfly. And you see, which looks like a grasshopper and some other insect. And these are exquisitely done, very detailed. Sometimes they even use a brush that might be the one horsehair, because in order to get these beautiful details, you had to use very, very fine brushes. And so you can see the vegetal or floral elements to this still life. There were often, as I said, multiple pages, and it took an extremely detailed hand to create these. So this is still life, not in a painted painting, for example, but it in illuminated manuscripts. Now, we're going to move on to a miniature of St. Luke painting the Virgin. And if you recall, St. Luke was the patron saint of artists. He was also the patron saint of physicians. And so very important, particularly in the north. Now, this is a Netherlandish or Flemish, actually we'll use the term Flemish for this beautiful Joanna I of Castile, and it's St. Luke painting the Virgin. Now, the Book of Hours were meant as prayer, to highlight prayers to the Virgin, for example. Sometimes they incorporated calendars. Now, if you look at the bottom of St. Luke here, you have some writing in red and you have some writing in black. The red is generally the patron saints that are being highlighted. For example, St. Luke, and then you might have some saints' days written in the black. But look at, we're going to move away from this figurative element and just look at the exquisite emerging still life. We have, looks like could be almost Delftware, although this is Flemish. We have exquisite detailed flowers and birds, and the butterfly, which in iconography is the resurrection. So there's all this kind of hidden meaning and this beauty of flowers. And of course, it's figurative, St. Luke painting the Virgin. Now, one of the most important Flemish painters was a man named Gerard Hornebout. And Hornebout was one of the artists who did create this beautiful manuscript. He also worked with a number of other artists because he had a really great studio for making these manuscripts. Now, if you look at the date and you say, 1500, well, I thought the printing press was invented. And yes, of course, it had been invented. So books were no longer just the provenance of the very aristocratic or royal. They could be made for other people, for example. But when you had a manuscript, illuminated manuscript from this time period, it indicates that the person who commissioned it would have been of great wealth. Also, I want to point out one more thing. These pages of the manuscript, they use vellum or parchment. And vellum and parchment were using animal membrane or skin. And they're very similar. One uses some type of animals, one the other. But this is why these pages are they're not so ephemeral. They actually withstood a lot of time. Probably when I'm going to go to the next illuminated manuscript, this is considered the most valuable illuminated manuscript probably ever created. The Rothschild Prayer Book, Book of Hours. Again, prayers, calendars, the Book of Hours, prayers to the Virgin and hours to commemorate her, and then many times calendars. This is, if you just look at it, is beyond beautiful. Gerard Hornebout also was one of the creators of this illuminated manuscript. And again, it was the aristocracy who would commission it. Now, we don't exactly know who in particular commissioned this, but it's called the Rothschild Prayer Book. As you know, the Rothschilds had vast wealth and vast collections, and it was owned by the Rothschilds. They were one of the later owners of it. And unfortunately, during the Nazi horrors, this manuscript was taken from the Rothschild family. And it was not allowed to ever go really back to the family. It was stayed in museums in Europe. But just look at the beauty of this. Look at the amazing, this iris and these other flowers. It looks like maybe some wildflowers. And this exquisite, she holds a prayer book, and the coloration is sensational, these rich natural pigments. But I do want to point out one thing that's just so clever. They did in the Renaissance and medieval times and much earlier, we have these mythical creatures, and they were hybridized. Like if you look at ancient times, you would think of the Sphinx, for example, or in Greece, the centaurs and minotaurs and satyrs. So throughout history in art and in mythology, we have the creation of these fanciful figures. And so, of course, I wanted to point this out. But this, of course, this was sold, I believe, about 20 years ago to an Australian businessman, and it was sold for more money than has ever been paid for a work of manuscript illumination. Now, let's fast forward to when still life painting really took on in the latter part of the Renaissance. And as I mentioned, during kind of the Middle Ages, let's say the 12th, 13th century, we don't see really still life for still life's sake. Why is that? Because it is kind of in the control of the Catholic Church, a lot of art, and we don't have secular subject matter being that important. We have portraiture and more historic and religious paintings, and still life was kind of considered a lesser category. Remember, religious paintings, historical paintings, those are really important, and still life kind of took a backseat. But I would like to prove to you, as I mentioned earlier, that still lifes convey quite a bit. So this is by the great artist Hans Memling. Hans Memling was German, but he did go to the Netherlandish region, and he was influenced by Roger van der Weyden, the great Netherlandish painter. And he also did some wonderful religious paintings. If you go to the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, I recommend, because there's one of the most beautiful and naturalistic small portraits of Jesus that you will ever see. He was known for being a painter of very naturalistic style. But let's talk about this still life. So in reality, it's a still life, but it is on the back of one panel of an altarpiece. And the altarpiece had a portrait on the front, maybe the donor, I don't recall, but it's not just a still life, it has a subliminal meaning. What is that? Well, it refers to Jesus, it refers to Mary, and the crucifixion. How is that? Well, first of all, this is the emblem of Jesus, and these are flowers, clematis, iris, and lily, and we know that lily, the white lily, is sort of the ubiquitous reference to the Virgin Mary. And it's set in this beautiful niche with a little light and shadow. And we have what would be, we don't use that term anymore, but it was be the style Oriental carpet, a beautiful carpet. And you have this Majorca ware, which is an earthenware painted with a tin applique. So it was a still life, but it wasn't exactly still life for still life's sake. As I said, it was the back of a portrait and was in a religious context. Now, I do want to bring up a very famous altarpiece called the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes, a contemporary of Hans Memling, Netherlandish. And Hugo van der Goes, this Portinari altarpiece, one of the most famous ever done, and I'm sorry I don't have an image of it, but if you look at the feet, it's called the Adoration of the Shepherds. And, that's the subject matter. And at the feet of the shepherds are beautiful floral arrangements. So it is a point that in some of these religious paintings, starting in the 15th century, we will begin to see the emergence of still life. Now, the greatest Northern Renaissance painter was Albrecht Dürer. And Albrecht Dürer paints this large piece of turf, considered one of the earliest still life for still life's sake ever created. Now, you might say, still life, isn't this more of a botanical drawing? And I would say you're probably correct. But I did incorporate it because I wanted to show you how still life artists use this concept of botanical drawings to incorporate very realistic elements to their pieces. And one other piece that was done about the same time, actually a year later, was called, was The Hair. And it's a beautiful live hair still that Durer captured. And so these are among the two earliest still lifes. This is a watercolor and gouache. And how did he create this? Some people said, well, did he go to eye level and sort of lie on his stomach and paint this? Most likely not. He probably took some type of device and he scooped out this little element of turf and he took it to his studio and then detailed it. What do we see here? Grass, wild grass and yarrow and all manner of thistle. It's just exquisite, so hyper real and beautiful. Now, Durer was a very influential artist. He was from Nuremberg. His father was a silversmith, but he traveled extensively. He was a prodigy, I want to say. He was a prodigy by age 13, 14. He was painting these magnificent portraits of his father, for example, this famous goldsmith. And he began to not only create individual artworks, but he was known to be a very accomplished printmaker. So his work, particularly one series called The Apocalypse, started filtering through Europe because this was the time of the printing press and multiple imagery, not only in art, but in books. So books and information could be disseminated through other parts of Europe. He also loved to travel, and he did spend a lot of time in Italy. He became interested in the work of the Bellini brothers, and he also looked at earlier work by Mantegna. So he loved the Italians, and the Italians loved him. So they were very influenced by his work. So Albrecht Dürer eventually worked with some of the aristocratic court in Nuremberg, but he did definitely, his work definitely was prominent in Europe at this time. Now, Jacopo de Barberi, interestingly enough, was cross-pollinated. His work was cross-pollinated with the great Albrecht Dürer. Why is that? Well, because Barberi was from Venice, and he too traveled to Nuremberg in Germany, where Albrecht Dürer originated. And so they really knew each other's work. And of course, Dürer was one of the most important artists at that time. So most people who were involved with working and making art would know his work. So I wanted to mention this painting because some people say it might be the very first still life. If we think about, it was the same time period as The Hair, but this is a magnificent form of still life. And he uses what's called trompe l'oeil, fool the eye. And nowadays, when you think about trompe l'oeil, you think, that's pretty ubiquitous. You can see it in the 19th century, etc. But if you look at the work of John Peto, for example, we have a Peto in our Timken collection. But in this early part of the 16th century, the emergence of still life, this was rare to see trompe l'oeil. So what are we looking at? We have oil on wood. And remember, it's in the 16th century, a little bit later in the 16th century, that we begin to see more use of canvas, particularly in Italy. But here, this is on wood, oil. And what do we have? We have a partridge. And the partridge is being pinned to this wall of a hunting lodge, we assume, because this is the accoutrements of a hunt. We have the implement of a crossbow, I forget the name of that term, but let's say the arrow of a crossbow. So it holds this gauntlet. And what are gauntlet? This is the element of medieval armor. So these were loose cuffed armor. You can see the armor plates here, and they would be used in fighting or hunting. And so it's been skewed by this crossbow arrow. I keep calling it arrow. And look how beautiful. It looks like you could just touch it. It looks so three-dimensional. So he was a very clever at this three-dimensionality. It's considered probably one of the first still lifes ever created. There's his signature here. And most likely it was used for an affluent family's hunting lodge. All right, for time's sake, I will go on. And now let's talk about one of the most beautiful still lifes I think ever created. And this one is by Juan Sanchez de Coton. And de Coton was Spanish, of course. And he was in this school where we have, he was a little earlier, but we have Murillo and Zurbarán, these realist artists from the Spanish Baroque. Now, you have to remember that at this time, in the early part of the 17th century, we have the Protestant Reformation. And so when we start to look at the Dutch and Flemish paintings, well, Dutch particularly because they were Protestant, you will see a move away from religious paintings. And why have I mentioned religious paintings? Because this is not a religious painting, but it is, there's a sensibility of almost a religious nature to it, like a vegetal altar, an altar that transcends the real world and goes into the world of spirituality. So de Cotton actually became a Carthusian lay monk, but for a long time in Spain, he was extremely popular and became very, very sought after. What does he paint here? Well, he paints these suspended, we have the quince, the melon, the cabbage, and the cucumber. And we have this cucumber kind of cantilevered over a ledge. And look at this inky black, almost otherworldly presence. Excuse me. The Spanish Baroque artists, who were still very Catholic, remember this is the time of the Counter-Reformation, an attempt to sort of counter the advent of Protestantism that begins about 1517 with Martin Luther nailing the 97 Treatise on the wall of the church. Of course, Martin Luther had been Catholic, but he was moving away from Catholicism and starting this Reformation. Now, these vegetables, why are they suspended? And I've told this story before in other presentations that when there's no refrigeration, how do you preserve fruits and vegetables? Well, you hang them, you suspend them. And when I was a young woman, I lived in a small town called Zamora in an old building that had actually been built in the Renaissance. And there was no refrigeration and no hot water. It was a pretty grim, but kind of interesting time. And they told us, suspend your fruits and vegetables because it will stop it from getting spoiled, at least to some extent, and also maybe the insects would not attach to it. What else does this represent? You know, about 1607, Galileo was beginning to look at the celestial bodies. So the beginning emergence of scientific study was occurring. So no, he did not see the celestial images from a telescope, but Galileo was present in Europe at this time. And I think knowledgeable people were aware of some of his potential discoveries or what he was exploring. So why I say that is because these suspended fruits and vegetables do have a relationship to perhaps celestial viewing. And remember, we already had way ahead of this celestial navigation. So looking at the heavenly bodies. And then, of course, we have this other concept. It's called the Archimedes hyperbola. And Archimedes hyperbola relates to a mathematical conjecture that was known among the intelligentsia. And we know that Cotton did have a rather highborn collector base, for want of a better term. And so he might have been referencing with this half cut melon, this sphere that's been opened. And then you see these beautiful seeds. And look at light. Okay, realism, very prominent in the Spanish still life painters. And also this idea of light, because light in still life painting is so amazing. And I should have mentioned, and I failed to mention, that even with the Roman Herculaneum, the still life with peaches, if you looked at the glassware, you could see even earlier times the Romans were looking at the possibility of light creating such beauty in a still life painting. Now, I was just discussing with Blythe, who of course is very involved with the study of art history and is going on to work in the field. We were discussing that in some ways, this Zurbarán may be considered one of the most beautiful still lifes ever created. If you read the work of Peter Steldahl, he's a art writer for the New Yorker, and I love his writing. And if you get a chance, do look him up. But he wrote a beautiful treatise about how he felt that Zurbarán's painting this painting was the most magnificent still life ever created. And I kind of have to agree with them. So let's talk about it a little bit. You can see by the date that Zurbaran was influenced by Caravaggio. Caravaggio's presence in Europe was so prominent in terms of the study of light in chiaroscuro. The Spaniards took it one step further. They took this idea of chiaroscuro and created what is called tenebrism. Tenebrism is usually seen when we have a very high contrast with dark inky black and the light as it falls on these oranges. Now, what does this represent? It is actually very symbolic still life. It's not just a still life of lemons and oranges and a pewter cup with a rose. It is really an homage to the Virgin Mary. And we can see that really easily with the pewter cup of water and the rose, which is her purity. And then it goes on to her importance and the beauty of the natural world. So this does reference the Virgin Mary. Look how beautiful the light falls on these objects and the realism. These Spanish artists were fascinated by the idea of realism, and they studied the nuances of fruits and flowers, and it looks like you could almost touch it. This is meant to be an altar to the Virgin Mary. And again, like the Khotan, there is a sensibility of transcending the temporal world and going into the spiritual realm. And you feel that, you almost feel so deeply connected to both elements when you look at this. Lastly, I do want to point out that, and I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating, the Norton Simon is a wonderful collection, has a wonderful collection, and their Baroque and the Renaissance and Baroque paintings are quite remarkable, and of course other works that they have, but you can see this Norton in the Norton Simon in Pasadena, and I do recommend that you visit. Now, we're going to go on into a different region, and we are going to look at our very own Petra Klaus, and this is in the Timken collection, and it is just a remarkable still life. And what does it refer to? Well, still life really becomes prominent and very developed in the 17th century in Holland. It is also carried over into Belgium, but remember, Belgium still is under the realm of the Habsburgs. So that means religious paintings still are created, but they still are remarkable still life painters. But if you look at the Dutch painting, so this is the time well into the bifurcation of what would be today Holland in the north and Belgium in the south, which at one point was the Netherlandish region. So Belgium retains its Flemish character, and the Dutch are a completely, really separate culture and they were Protestant. And because they were Protestant, they move away from big historical paintings, although Rembrandt did, of course, and even Rubens, but those are more portraits of militia, but they gravitate toward more, quote, middle-class themes. What do the Dutch people like? What are their lives like? What objects do they have in their home? They like to do genre pictures that detail the interiors of their homes, but they were very gifted still life painters. And just a little reminder that the Dutch in the 17th century were the most developed economy. They had the greatest military. Their art, the development of art in what would be today Holland was exquisite. And science, von Leeuwenhoek is involved with the invention of the microscope, the use of optical devices. So the Dutch had a very strong economy. And for that, it's no longer art as the provenance of the aristocracy and the ultra wealthy. You could be a middle-class person or upper middle-class person and participate in collecting art. So this is what was called a stilleven, a still life, and it's a breakfast scene at smoker's requisite. So here are the elements of a smoker's requisite. The ashes that they come down in this brazier. We have the pipes and tobacco. We also have the breakfast. We have a Venetian glassware with a half full glass of beer for breakfast. Yes, they did drink that. And then the fish cantilevered over the tabletop. Now, this is a simpler still life. We know that because we don't see really amazing carpentry or tablecloths. We have a pewter and earthenware jug turned over, but look how optically exquisite this is. This looks like a photograph. And I hope when you go see the reopened magnificent Timken that just reopened, and you go to our Dutch and Flemish gallery and take a look at this marvelous still life, because Peter Claus was considered the preeminent Dutch still life painter in the city of Haarlem. And last month I did a lecture on Haarlem in the 17th century, and you might want to go back and reference it, but it incorporates not only, of course, still life, but also portraiture and landscape. Now, we have to talk about the theme of vanitas. The Dutch were known, really known for this idea of vanitas. And what it means is it's combined with the idea of memento mori, reminder that you will die. And so the Dutch did have a moralizing and also kind of a religious quality subliminally, because, you know, life is short, and remember that. And we also want to remember that sometimes our everyday objects are kind of unimportant when we consider the spiritual life. So this has a moralizing characteristic, the vanitas idea. And then we have why? Well, we have a half full glass of beer, life half over, dying fish cantilevered to show his skill, and then of course the burning embers. So this is what we considered a vanitas painting. Has its Protestant in its subject matter stylistically, and look at the realism again. Like the Spanish painters, the Dutch also were very interested in close observations of nature and light. Light is something they work with and develop to such an exquisite detail. Now, as always, I start to run a little long, and I want to move a little more quickly. So Willem Claus Heyde. One thing I want to remind you, Peter Claus was actually Flemish. He was born in Antwerp, where the great Peter Paul Rubens lived, but he did immigrate to Haarlem. Well, Willem Claus Heyde was Dutch, and he was from Haarlem, and he, along with Willem Claus, Peter Claus, was the greatest still life painters of that Dutch Baroque. Now, if you look at this painting, it looks like so much more elaborate, and it was done a little after the Peter Claus. And what it indicates is that by a little bit later in the 17th century, the Dutch had really expanded their empire, and they were going into all kinds of foreign ports, and they were bringing back lemons from Spain and glassware from Venice and carpets and porcelain from countries in Asia. So you begin to see more elaborate objects. So this is called a romer, a glass goblet that it had to have these projections because, of course, you want to pick up a big goblet, you don't want it to drop. And this tazo, which is a silver dish. Well, what is the moralizing undertones of this? What are the memento mori or the vanitas theme? Well, broken glass. Temperance. The Dutch were a moderate society. Now, we do have the oyster, and some people do liken that to sensuality, and he might be commenting on, you know, keep our vices to a lower level because we don't, that's the Dutch way. But we also have another reminder of time passing, because this is an almanac and it was wrapped in a cone and probably spices were put in it, but it is an almanac. And again, this idea of ephemeral nature of life. I'm going to go on, and I do want to look at the painting of Jan Bruegel. Now, Jan Bruegel was called Velvet Bruegel, and he was Netherlandish. He was Flemish. His father was painting in both Catholic and Christian themes. His father, the great Peter Bruegel, one of the greatest Northern Renaissance painters ever. And if you go to the Timken today, you will see the most magnificent landscape, Parable of the Sower, by his father. Now, you might say, well, his father was one of the greatest Northern Renaissance painters. Who taught Jan Bruegel? Because he came from a dynasty. There was Jan Bruegel the Elder, there was Jan Bruegel the Younger, but it was his grandmother who actually taught him how to paint. And he concentrated on floral paintings mostly, but look at stylistically. If we go back to this, excuse me, let me just see if we go back, and I'm not going back, yes. Look how tight and realistic this brushstroke is. And of course, this is Dutch, but when you look at Bruegel, he had a much softer touch. That's why we called him Velvet Bruegel, or he was called Velvet Bruegel. And there's almost like a very gestural painterly quality. So he also incorporates memento mori. We have a butterfly that relates to the resurrection. We also have jewels down here and bugs. Well, jewels, diamonds, pearls, why? You can barely see them, but even though jewels and pearls seem to be hard and, you know, they could withstand generations, really what he was commenting on is that just like a flower, even jewels can be ephemeral because they're not as important as our spiritual life. Now, lastly, you remember, you know, the Dutch, this wasn't quite the time of tulipomania, what comes about 20 years later, this fixation on tulips, but tulips would begun to come from the steppes of Russia and Asia into Turkey, tulip from the word turban, and they begin to be incorporated in Dutch and Flemish paintings. Now, you would never see all these paintings all these flowers together in this earthenware container because they weren't blooming at the same time. So he studied flowers, he brought them back to his studio, took sketches of them, and he puts an abundance of flowers together, even though in nature they wouldn't be. Now, I want to mention Jean-Baptiste Simon Chardin. Chardin was a Rococo painter, but he moved away from the excesses of the Rococo. He did study a bit with Fragonard, and he lived almost his entire life in Paris. He loved to create still lifes. He wasn't interested in history painting, not so much. He did do some beautiful portraits, particularly a little bit later. He did suffer from some eye conditions. So there's all these a little softer quality in his later works, but look how beautifully done. Now, someone might say fruit. Well, I guess it's the fruit of the earth, of wheat, creating bread, and this wonderful glass of, grapes, the drink of the gods, so to speak. So this is a very beautifully detailed still life. Chardin is considered one of the greatest still life painters. And of course, he comes from France. Now, France wasn't really known like Spain, Italy, not so much either. It was an artist in Naples, for example, and a few works by Caravaggio around 1610, 1605 that we begin to see a lot of more still life. But it's really the Dutch and Flemish and the Spaniards who were known for their beautiful still lifes. Now, I'm going to go on. Anne Villars-Koster. She was one of the few women who was allowed into the academy. And she too was a member of the court's painters, not that Chardin was, but she definitely was, because she painted for Marie Antoinette. And she was known to incorporate a lot of silver. Why silver? Because her father was a silversmith and very well known among the aristocracy. So she often incorporated aspects of his work in this painting. Now, as I said, she was one of the 4 women admitted to the academy. Her connections to the French court withstood later on the French Revolution. Why? Because she was really a hardworking, very respected still life painter. And just like Jacques-Louis David, their skill allowed them to kind of stay away from what was happening with some of the people after the French Revolution. So because I don't have a lot of time, I just want to point out this exquisite lobster, the beauty of the sea, the importance of the sea and the silver. And she did not do a lot of figurative work. Why is that? Because women did not have a lot of access to painting people from models. They could paint their family, of course, but she has less figurative work. But look how the light, look how she's incorporated aspects of light, even though these look like very elegant objects. Her husband was an aristocrat. She did marry into aristocrat, but she was known to be a really skilled, hardworking, actually apolitical individual. Now, I have to show you this. Oh, is this just magnificent? Manet. All right. the carnations and clematis in crystal. Clematis is a vine flower, so it kind of works its way up, but we see it not so much here. We see these beautiful carnations, and look at the soft light. Now, this is the time of French Impressionism, but Manet wasn't really associated that directly with the French Impressionists. He knew them. He didn't really want to be lumped in. And some people say a painting that he did 20 years earlier, Déjeuner célèbre, was considered the first really truly modern painting. So Manet was a part of this whole movement of modernism, even though he works in the 19th century, but he loved to incorporate aspects. He loved the Spanish artists. If you look at some of his paintings, not this, of course, this is soft and elegant, but if you look at some of his paintings, you will notice that there's a lot of incorporation of the dark background that the Spanish use. Why was that? Well, he loved the work of Velázquez, and some of the others, Murillo and Zurbarán, but particularly Velázquez, and of course also Goya. But he did see some of the Spanish dancers who would come through Paris, and it was Berthe Morisot, who was a French female impressionist, who got him to sort of, okay, I know you don't like the Impressionists, don't want to exhibit with them, but let's take a look at some of the things that they're doing, particularly with flora. So this is an exquisite Manet that is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Okay, so we have only about 5 minutes, and I do want to quickly go through Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. Of course, we know that Van Gogh was what's considered a post-impressionist. He was not an impressionist, although he was aware of the work of the Impressionists. He loved sunflowers. Why? Well, his mother grew sunflowers in her garden. And when he encountered the great post-impressionist artist Gauguin, who he actually lived with for a short time in Arles, Gauguin said, hey, I really like this. I really like this sunflower that you did. And he was given the sunflower painting by Van Gogh, and he always liked it a lot. So Van Gogh associated success with, painting sunflowers. So somebody likes them. So he did at least 5, and some of them are just a sunflower laid on a tabletop, or this profusion of sunflowers. He loved their sort of homely aspect. He also loved the idea of seeds and yellow. Yellow to him was Jesus, because he had been a lay preacher. His father was a preacher, and he loved the idea of this incorporates sort of sunshine and Jesus. So yellow was one of his favorite colors. But look at this acerbic coloration. This puts him firmly in the realm of post-impressionist. Now, our very own Martin John Heade. Martin Johnson Heade was a Hudson River painter. And he was known to be a little bit divergent from the Hudson River painters because he didn't do as many Catskill Mountains or the West. He painted in South America, hummingbirds. He painted the magnolia blossoms, which he saw in Florida when he moved there a little bit later in his life. And he was a magnificent still life painter. And he really fixated on magnolia blossoms. And as you can see, it is in our very own Timken collection. Most of the magnolia blossoms that he painted, he did 15. This was the only one that was done on a red velvet. The others were blue. So this is kind of remarkable. Now, what does the flower indicate? Remember, subliminally, the flower is a memento mori, an idea of the ephemeral nature of life. And if you ever want to explore that concept, look at Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare, because it talks about how do I compare you to a summer's day, and looking at the creation of something and comparing it to the ephemeral nature of life, a beauty in an individual, a perfectly written sonnet, and a painting of a flower. The flower might wilt and die, just like life goes in this circle, but also you will have it recorded in this lovely still life. Now we just have 3 more paintings. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go through quickly. André Matisse was known, this is a pre-Fauve painting. This was done when he moved to the south of France, and he was so captured by the beauty of the sea. And if you visit a place called Antibes, which is above Nice, where he lived, Antibes in Nice, Nice is the home of Matisse's homes, and then Antibes Picasso. But I do want to point out that he loved yellow, of course, and Matisse, along with Picasso, one of the greatest artists of, we'll say, the 20th century, later part of the 19th century, he was known as the greatest colorist, but he wanted people to look at his paintings and not be agitated, but really calm by their beauty. Now, I have just a couple more, and I hope you'll bear with me just going over maybe a couple minutes, but this is Giorgio Morandi. And this is part of what is called a metaphysical still life painting, along with De Chirico. They were part of this metaphysical movement, what this is effort to create this sense of calm and contemplation in a work of art. And this is a magnificent still life, but if you look closely, and if you know his work, he really didn't paint living flowers. I mean, living meaning he cut them and put them in a vase or something. He often painted faux flowers. And you might say, ooh, for me, that's a little disconcerting because I love, beautiful fresh flowers, but this was not meant to be just a comment on flowers, but more a comment on the aspect of metaphysical nature, a contemplative space. Morandi really only left Italy, his town of Bologna, once, and that was when this painting was exhibited in this country of Switzerland. Now, I have to show you, actually, I'm very connected to Paul Warner in the sense I did do my master's thesis on the work of Paul Warner. He was a Bay Area figurative artist, along with artists such as David Park, Richard Diebenkorn, and a whole slew of artists, Theophilus Brown, and they were moving away from abstraction, which was the height of abstract expressionist movement, and of minimalism, which comes after abstract expressionists. And they were beginning to go back to some form of realism. Now, if you look at this, you can't help seeing Dutch influence because it even says it in the title. He was enamored with the Dutch and the Flemish painters. But he set his in a much more almost surreal space. He considered his still life paintings puzzles, and he arranges things from his life. I did have the pleasure of meeting him and talking a little bit about what influenced him. And he also liked the idea of a space that was kind of disconcerting because we almost feel like something would fall. But look at this beautiful porcelain. These are objects from everyday, everything from beautiful objects to, household objects. And portrait, this could be a Rachel Reich or of Jan Bruegel. So lastly, the last image I want to show you is, I had the privilege of knowing this artist, Bruce Cohen. Bruce Cohen was a student of, Paul Warner did his MFA at Berkeley, and Bruce Cohen did study with him for a time at Berkeley. So his work is greatly influenced by Paul Warner. And we see that Bruce Cohen brings in flowers, and these are obviously not flowers, but he brings things in from his garden. Lives in Santa Monica, beautiful floral garden, and he brings only things from his garden. He never goes to the flower markets, or very rarely. And then, of course, maybe fruits from his garden. So this is, and look at this architectural space that he incorporates. He's a surrealist and a realist. And with that, I will conclude, and hopefully we have, I'm sorry for going over a few minutes, but hopefully I finally got to the very end of my presentation. Normally I always run over time and don't get to show every painting, but I was lucky enough to get them all in. So Blythe, hopefully we have some questions or comments. Please feel free to jump in and ask. Any questions, Blythe?
Sorry, my internet cut out for 2 seconds. I couldn't hear you. I was waiting for it to jump back in, but I can hear you now. Well, thank you so much for that, Karen. That was awesome. And I love those 2 last paintings that you just gave. I mean, the other one,
Paul Warner.
I love the blues and everything, of the light and of the vase. Yeah, no, it reminds me of a lot of the kind of Chinese inspiration that the Dutch ceramics have, and a
Absolutely.
lot of the blue. So I really liked that.
You're absolutely correct, because obviously this is Chinese, but then also that influence of blue from Delaware and that sort of thing. But, I just want to make a really quick point. When I proposed doing a thesis on Paul Warner, some people said he's retro. And, because at the time, so many things, neo-expressionism was alive. But I thought what I loved is that kind of quote retroism, in that he does harken back to historical paintings. And I felt that it was made the work even stronger to weave in history with, a more contemporary presence and style. So just wanted to sort of validate why I chose him. Were there any other questions, or any questions, Blythe?
So far I've seen it in the chat, but I did just, want to open it up again to anybody. You can either unmute yourself too, if you'd rather join in. We always love a good discussion, so it's fun. So we welcome that type of participation, as well as if you'd rather, you can type in the chat and I can relay the questions. And then I'll just ask Kendra if there are any questions from Facebook Live. And other than that, I don't see any right now, but yeah, okay, so we don't have any in the Facebook Live. So just, if there's anybody here. Oh, Ian, I see Ian has a hand up.
Yeah, and then there's a Michelle is raising her hand too, so hopefully we can, Ian.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so we'll do Ian first and then Michelle after.
Okay, so I'm unmuted because I didn't want to type in, it would take too long. But Karen, the one painting that you showed a couple back from here, the metaphysical still life.
Oh yeah, the Morandi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How large is that?
Oh, what a good question. Why can't I? Sometimes I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting back. Very small, Ian. They're very small. I did see a whole exhibition of Morandi's work at the Guggenheim. I mean, just a lot of his work. He's rather prolific. Almost all of them very small. So I would say maybe 24 by 24. They're small. They're very, very small.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you. They're beautiful. They're beautiful.
Aren't they? They're so, there's such a departure when you think about still life, because they're not natural elements. Oh, one thing I want to point out, because what we are talking about, he was actually as well known for doing bottles and like cups. He did a lot of very bottle-like shapes, and they're almost cubistic, but he liked a very muted palette. But as you bring up, they're beautiful, and he can create a beautiful work of art using a limited palette, just like Peter Klaus and Willem Klaus Hede. A lot of times use a very monochromatic palette in some of their works, and it shows that there's depth and beauty even in a limited range of color. But thank you for your question.
Yes.
I think Michelle, I see your name. Did you have a question? If we could answer that. Oh, I guess not. As we're waiting, I just want to put another plug in for the new and improved Timken. It is absolutely remarkable. If you haven't had a chance to visit Balboa Park, it is so well worth a visit to see all the great works of art, some new artwork added, and see how exquisite the galleries are, and how the air filtration system just makes everything so clean and fresh. So please take some time to visit the Timken if you can. So no more questions, Blythe?
I don't see any questions, and if there's nobody else that wants to raise their hand or chime in, then I don't think we have any more in the audience. But yes, definitely following up on that plug that you had there, Karen, I agree. Everyone should go see the new and improved Timken, and look out for the I think it's ironwork. Is it the ironwork on the doors?
Oh yeah, beautiful bronze.
Brass? It's either brass or ironwork on the doors.
Right.
They're beautiful. And definitely look out for those. You can't miss them. And yeah, just also the Timken's the only free museum in San Diego. So it's super easy for, I don't know how many of the people watching us are actually in San Diego currently, or if, sometimes people are from all over. So if you are planning a trip to San Diego, it's a great activity for a day trip to go. And, it's a free museum. So
absolutely.
take a look.
Last plug for the museum, because Ian is one of my colleagues at the Timken. He does, he and his wife do tours for people. So I do want to just remind viewers that I am going to continue with the lectures online as some of the other docents will be doing. So we're going to continue the same schedule of Thursday and my Arts Reach, which is Wednesday. But now, because the museum is open, you will also have the opportunity to be guided through with individuals like Ian, his wife, and others who still are doing tours, now re-emerging with the opening of the museum. So that was my last plug. But Blythe, thank you so much. Thank you, viewers. I hope to see you next month with Arts Reach.
Of course. And for our presentation schedule, if you enjoyed this presentation and would like to join us for another one, we have another presentation tomorrow, which is going to be entitled Holbein. Sorry, let me just get the title so I don't. Holbein Capturing Character, and that's tomorrow at 11 a.m. And then next Thursday, we have another lecture at 11 a.m. entitled Iconic Latin American Painters. So if you'd like to join us for either of those, it's going to be in Zoom link tomorrow and next Thursday. Or not the same Zoom link as this one, but tomorrow and next Thursday are both the same Zoom links. So this is the Arts Reach, so this is a different link, but you can find the other link as well.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank you
good
so
day,
much, everyone. I know.
Oh.